In a chilling cell phone video recovered by Florida investigators, 32-year-old Sonia Exelby appears bruised and hesitant as a man off camera presses her to state how she wants to die. This vulnerable British woman had flown across the Atlantic in October 2025, not for a dream vacation, but for a dark purpose. She allegedly arranged to have a Florida man do horrific things to her and then ultimately kill her. Yet even as she haltingly consents on camera to her violent end, her visible hesitation hints that she may have been having second thoughts. Just days later, Exelby's remains were found buried in a Florida woodland grave, and an international investigation raced to unravel how this macabre pact turned deadly. Sonia Exelby was by all accounts a troubled soul seeking a way out. Hailing from Portsmouth, England, she had privately battled extreme mental health issues for a long period. British investigators later discovered writings on her computer, and even a letter, in which Exelby described plans to travel overseas to be killed. She even anticipated with apparent excitement that she might be mutilated or disabled if the grim plan didn't finish her off. On October 10, 2025, Exelby boarded a flight to Florida, arriving at Gainesville Regional Airport with this fatal mission in mind. Family and friends were unaware of the full extent of her intentions, but they knew she was vulnerable. When Exelby failed to return on her scheduled flight back to the UK 3 days later, alarm bells rang. She had missed her October 13th return flight without explanation, prompting her loved ones to report her missing. One concerned friend posted on social media that Exelby was a vulnerable person, likely in an extremely dangerous situation after meeting someone in Florida. Unfortunately, their worst fears would soon be confirmed in the most disturbing way possible. By mid-October, the disappearance of Sonia Exelby had escalated into a cross-border case. On October 13th, UK authorities contacted the Florida Department of Law Enforcement via Interpol, urgently reporting Exelby as a missing and endangered person. The information they provided was startling. Exelby had openly discussed wanting a violent death and traveled specifically to find someone to carry it out. This was no ordinary missing tourist. It was a potential arranged meetup with the expressed purpose of ending her life. Florida law enforcement immediately joined the search, aware that time might be running out. Authorities had access to her digital footprint, including the ominous letter and online communications, which revealed the depths of her desperation. Armed with these clues, Florida authorities began retracing Exelby's steps from the moment she landed in the state. Central to the investigation was identifying who Exelby had come to meet. It didn't take long for detectives to zero in on a suspect, Dwayne Hall, a 53-year-old man from Ocala, Florida. Hall was no stranger. Evidence later showed that he and Exelby had first connected about 2 years earlier on a website called Motherless. I decided I wouldn't look this one up for my research, and based on the descriptions of the site I've read, I'd suggest you also do the same. On this platform known for extreme content, the two allegedly formed a twisted pact. Hall claimed that Exelby had reached out because she wanted someone to kill her, and he answered the call. According to police reports, Hall portrayed himself as a kind of, quote, mentor, trying to talk the woman through her dark desires. In reality, he admitted he had violent tendencies of his own. Investigators suspect that Hall was an eager participant in Exelby's deadly plan. They allege that he was fully prepared to kill her from the outset, a theory supported by his suspicious actions before and after her arrival. In fact, Hall had gone shopping at a Walmart for rope and a shovel right before picking Exelby up at the airport, indicating careful preparation for what was to come. After landing on October 10th, Exelby met Hall in person for the first time. Hall picked her up from the Gainesville airport and drove her to a rented Airbnb property on a quiet road in Reddick, Florida. There, over the course of that weekend, events took a gruesome turn. Hall admitted that he and Exelby had consensual encounters multiple times at the rental house. And just to be clear, these were his admissions, so whether anything was ever consensual remains highly contentious. But far from a vacation fling, the encounter reportedly devolved into extreme acts, allegedly with consent. Hall himself confessed to taking a disturbing video on his cell phone during the weekend, a video he tried to delete but which forensic experts recovered. The footage is harrowing. It shows Sonia Exelby in a disheveled state with bruises covering her body. In the video, Hall can be heard interrogating her, asking why she's here and seeking her explicit consent. Exelby's response is heartbreaking. She says she's there because she feels she's an awful person who has hurt everyone who ever loved her. It's a statement that underscores her fragile mental state. As Hall pressed her with questions about what she agrees to, she nods and gives answers. At one point indicating she consents to being stabbed, but detectives noted she appears hesitant, visibly upset, and afraid even as she acquiesces. It seems that in the cold reality of that Airbnb, Sonia Exelby began to regret the very fate she had sought. On October 11th, likely overnight during her captivity, Exelby managed to send a desperate message to a friend via the Discord messaging app. In that text, she revealed that the situation had spiraled beyond her control. She wrote that the man she was with had made it clear there was no way out. According to these messages, he advised that she could leave, but only if she killed him first. It's been speculated that this was another form of sick psychological control, knowing that this extremely emotionally distraught woman couldn't stand up for herself. Exelby lamented that she had expected him to end her life swiftly rather than prolong her terror and give her mind time to stew in fear. This chilling message, later recovered by investigators, shows she felt trapped, afraid, and realized she'd made a terrible mistake. Exelby's panicked communication would be her last. After October 11th, all activity from her phone and bank cards ceased. Unbeknownst to her friends or family, within a few days, Sonia would be dead. On October 17th, acting on investigative leads, Florida law enforcement made a grim discovery. Sonia Exelby's body was found in a shallow grave in a wooded, undeveloped area of Marion Oaks, Florida. The spot was not far from where she had been held. Forensic examiners quickly confirmed the identity of the remains through fingerprints. At the burial site, investigators uncovered critical evidence linking the crime to Dwayne Hall. Inside the makeshift grave, they found a price tag and label from a shovel that matched one recently purchased by Hall. In fact, receipts showed Hall bought a shovel just before picking Exelby up, and a matching shovel was later found stored in his garage, stained with Exelby's blood. This was the same shovel used to dig her grave, solidly tying the suspect to the body disposal. An autopsy provided further answers. The medical examiner determined that Sonia Exelby died from 4 stab wounds. Disturbingly, investigators learned that Hall had mailed a package to an associate in Ohio shortly after the killing. Acting on this lead, authorities in Ohio searched the recipient's home and discovered a knife that tested positive for blood and carried Exelby's DNA. It appeared Hall attempted to hide the bloody knife by sending it out of state, but law enforcement caught up with this evidence as well. Piece by piece, the physical proof was mounting against Dwayne Hall. Even before Exelby's body was found, investigators had begun following a trail of digital and financial clues that pointed squarely to Hall. One major red flag surfaced when Exelby's bank in the UK noticed unusual attempts to access her funds after she went missing. According to arrest affidavits, on October 11th and 12th, there were multiple tries to transfer money from Exelby's accounts to a Florida business. This was a company later tied directly to Dwayne Hall. In fact, a payment of roughly $1,000 was successfully made from Exelby's bank to a company that listed Hall's home address in Ocala. Other withdrawal attempts were declined, but this activity was enough to alert authorities. Hall effectively left a financial fingerprint by attempting to loot his victim's bank accounts almost immediately after her expected death. These transactions led law enforcement to identify Hall as a suspect early on. By tracing the Solver Wolf's roadside assistance company associated with those charges, investigators connected Dwayne Hall to Exelby's disappearance. And yes, this guy was a tow truck driver who was quote-unquote helping people out in difficult situations. Confronted by detectives, Dwayne Hall's responses raised immediate suspicions. Initially, Hall denied knowing Exelby at all and offered various inconsistent stories about his recent activities. But faced with evidence, including the financial links and possibly knowledge of the video, Hall's account shifted. He eventually admitted that he had indeed met up with Sonia Exelby and spent the weekend with her. Yet Hall painted himself not as a killer, but as a reluctant participant in a bizarre scenario. He claimed Exelby had essentially asked to be killed, and that he was trying to help her fulfill that wish. In an alleged attempt at justification, Hall told detectives that if he hadn't been acting consensually, he would have tossed her body to some gators. I like to call this the "if I did it" defense, named after O.J. Simpson's book of the same name. He stopped short of directly confessing to everything. When pressed point blank if he had killed her, Hall declined to answer. Chillingly, though, he said that she's happy now because she got what she always wanted. This unsettling statement suggested that Hall wanted police to believe he had merely given Exelby the violent end she sought. With a body recovered and a mountain of evidence, authorities moved swiftly to charge Dwayne Hall. On November 17, 2025, a little over a month after Sonia Exelby's death, Hall was formally arrested and charged. The charges reflect the allegations that he not only killed Exelby, but also unlawfully restrained her once she tried to back out. In addition, Hall faces a variety of charges for his financial crimes against Exelby, including fraudulent use of her credit card after he eliminated her. At the time the indictment was filed, Hall was already sitting in jail on those earlier fraud charges, meaning he had been in custody since mid-October. Hall's case has only just begun winding through the Florida courts, and he's pleaded not guilty to all 4 charges against him, and he remains innocent until proven guilty. The killing of Sonia Exelby stands as a heartbreaking cautionary tale. It highlights the extreme vulnerabilities of those struggling with mental illness, and how predators can take advantage of such despair. In the end, regardless of any prior agreement, the law is clear that no one can consent to their own killing. If the allegations hold true, Dwayne Hall took the life of a troubled young woman in a horrific manner, and he may pay for that with the remainder of his own. A routine trip to a Georgia Walmart turned into a nightmare on an October evening. The father of 18-year-old J.T. Schroeder rushed to the store parking lot after receiving the call no parent ever wants. He arrived to a horrific scene. His son lay critically injured in a pool of blood, surrounded by shocked bystanders. In the suburban shopping area of White Marsh Island, a normally quiet community just outside Savannah, the eruption of violence was startling and brutal. This shocking violence over something as trivial as a shopping cart left the community reeling. 48-year-old Delano Middleton was pushing his shopping cart out of the store when 18-year-old Schroeder allegedly kicked the cart while walking past. For reasons still unclear, that brief encounter exploded into violence within seconds. Middleton allegedly pulled out a knife in an instant and stabbed Schroeder multiple times in a frenzied attack. The teen was stabbed more than 10 times, according to his father's account of the crime scene. Bystanders immediately called 911, and officers arrived around 6 that evening to find Schroeder bleeding badly from numerous stab wounds. Emergency responders rushed the gravely injured teen to a local hospital. Despite doctors' efforts and life-saving measures, Schroeder couldn't be saved. He died from his wounds after a few days on life support. News of his death sent shockwaves through the community. Those who knew him spoke of his kind and selfless nature. His girlfriend said he had an incredibly big heart and a remarkably sweet soul, and friends noted he would do anything for the people he loved. At a candlelight vigil held in his honor, his father revealed he hadn't slept in weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the devastation done to his son. Right after the stabbing, police began working to piece together what happened and who was responsible. Both Middleton and witnesses were questioned by officers at the scene, but no charges were filed initially while the investigation was ongoing. The area was treated as a crime scene, as detectives gathered evidence and reviewed Walmart's security footage. Police said they would consult with the district attorney's office to determine appropriate charges, pending the victim's condition. For several days, Middleton remained under scrutiny, but wasn't charged while Schroeder clung to life in hospital. Once he passed away and the case became a clear homicide, authorities swiftly moved forward. 1 week after the attack, police secured a warrant and arrested Delano Middleton. He was booked into the Chatham County Jail and is being held without bond. And yes, in case you were wondering, and in case I wasn't clear enough, this psychopath was walking around on the streets for a week after stabbing an innocent teenager. But trust me, the twist gets so much worse, and it'll have you questioning why this man was turned loose to begin with. As the case unfolded, disturbing details about Middleton's past came to light. Court records showed he had a history of violence, with prior arrests for aggravated assault, battery, and weapons offenses in 2021 and 2023. Notably, he had stabbed another victim back in 2021, an attack on a Savannah woman named Erica Young that was similarly sudden and unprovoked. Young, a U-Haul employee, tried to help Middleton at her workplace, only to be viciously assaulted and knifed multiple times in the stomach and head. She recalled that during the frenzy, Middleton told her he wanted to watch her bleed out as she lay wounded on the ground, underscoring the level of rage in his actions. Middleton was eventually arrested for that crime and underwent a court-ordered psychiatric evaluation in 2022. The psychiatrist initially found him mentally unfit for trial, and after months of treatment, he was later ruled competent. In 2023, he pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of aggravated assault and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, followed by 8 years of probation. Having already served about 2 years behind bars awaiting the case's resolution, he was released on probation under the plea deal. Thus, at the time of Schroeder's slaying in 2025, Middleton was still on probation from the 2021 stabbing case. The revelation that a repeat violent offender was free to allegedly slay an innocent teen fueled outrage in Savannah. Erica Young was interviewed by a local Fox affiliate and was especially angered to see the man who nearly killed her now accused of doing the same thing to someone else. She bluntly said that the justice system completely failed, not only her, but the entire Schroeder family and society in general. Notably, Erica Young drove several hours to stand with the Schroeder family at his public memorial to show support. Bonded by trauma, the two families offered each other support and vowed to ensure that justice is served this time. As of now, Delano Middleton awaits trial, and if convicted, the 48-year-old faces the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. On a warm late summer afternoon in 1984, a group of teenagers boating along Rhode Island's narrow river made a gruesome discovery. Floating in the water was a floral-patterned sleeping bag, tightly secured with rope and weighed down by a cement cinder block. Inside, authorities found the body of 24-year-old Deborah Stone. The state medical examiner later confirmed what the scene had already suggested. Deborah had met with foul play. This chilling find on September 2nd, 1984, in the quiet town of Narragansett, marked the beginning of a decades-long search for the truth about what happened to Deborah Stone. In the days before her body surfaced, Deborah had simply vanished. The young woman was last seen on the night of August 28, 1984, when she went to visit an acquaintance, 32-year-old Robert Jeremiah, in Johnston, Rhode Island. According to witnesses and Jeremiah's own statements, Deborah had come by hoping to barter a stolen watch in exchange for drugs. Jeremiah, a man known to be involved in drug dealing and rumored to have possible mob connections, claimed he had no drugs to offer that night. He later told police that he gave Deborah a ride back to her apartment in Cranston and that she was alive and well when he left her. In fact, a few other people even reported seeing Deborah on August 30th, 2 days after her visit to Jeremiah. These accounts initially muddied the timeline of her disappearance and gave Jeremiah an air of plausible innocence in the early stages of the investigation. When questioned by investigators after Deborah's body was found, Jeremiah stuck to his story and offered an alternate explanation for her death. He claimed that Deborah had probably just overdosed on drugs. However, this story quickly fell apart. The medical examiner's autopsy showed clear signs of trauma to Deborah's neck, definitively ruling out an overdose and pointing to strangulation as the cause of death. In other words, Deborah had been forcibly choked, not accidentally overdosed, making it apparent that her death was no accident. With Jeremiah being the last known person to see her alive, suspicions began to circle around him despite his denials. From the outset, Narragansett police had reasons to eye Robert as the prime suspect, and what follows next is either a major dropping of the ball or perhaps something more sinister. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Deborah was with Jeremiah the night she disappeared. Investigators learned that Deborah took a taxi to Jeremiah's place and even had the stolen watch with her, corroborating parts of his account of that evening. Because some witnesses believed they saw Deborah alive after that night, and parts of Jeremiah's story checked out, detectives initially held off on naming him an official suspect. In hindsight, this hesitation proved costly, and it wasn't long before more damning information surfaced. In January 1986, about a year and a half after Deborah's death, an informant came forward with a shocking confession. He told police that he had been at Jeremiah's apartment on August 29, 1984, the night of Deborah's presumed slaying, and into the early hours of August 30th. This informant revealed that he had seen Deborah's lifeless body in Jeremiah's apartment, and had even helped Jeremiah dispose of the body by dumping it into the narrow river. He recounted specific details about the crime scene, details authorities had never released publicly, which lent significant credibility to his story. According to the informant, Jeremiah himself admitted that he, quote, had to eliminate Deborah because she was stealing from him. Despite the informant's insider knowledge and involvement, the investigation hit a frustrating standstill. As credible as his testimony seemed, the informant's reliability was thrown into doubt when he failed a police-administered polygraph. In the mid-1980s, law enforcement still put considerable trust in polygraph results. So when the informant stumbled on the lie detector, detectives grew skeptical of his account. In fact, investigators terminated their cooperation with this major informant after the single failed polygraph exam, even though he agreed to take another test to prove himself. With their key witness suddenly deemed unreliable, the case against Jeremiah collapsed. No arrest was made, and the investigation into Deborah Stone's death went cold. Today, polygraph tests are recognized as unreliable, but back in the 80s, an over-reliance on that flawed tool likely derailed the case. Whether that derailing was entirely organic, though, is something I'll be investigating further in a moment. For decades, Deborah's case languished without justice. Leads dried up, and without new evidence or willing witnesses, the file eventually found its way to the cold case shelves. Robert Jeremiah, the man long suspected in the shadows, never faced a courtroom for Deborah's slaying. He continued on with his life while suspicion quietly trailed him. Jeremiah's life, however, was about to come to an end as well. He died of either natural causes or an overdose in 1995 at the age of 43. And given his age and his proclivities, I'm going to lean towards the latter over the former. As years turned into decades, it seemed possible that the truth of what happened on that August night in 1984 might never fully come to light. Deborah's family and friends were left with painful questions and no closure, the memory of her loss hanging over them for 41 years. It wasn't until recent years that Deborah Stone's story was pulled back into the spotlight. In 2019, the Narragansett Police Department decided to reopen the dormant case, spurred by a fresh look at old evidence and a determination to set things right. Around the same time, Rhode Island's Attorney General launched a dedicated cold case unit in 2023 to re-examine unsolved homicides like Deborah's. This new unit brought together veteran investigators and modern forensic resources with a clear mission: deliver long-awaited answers for victims' families. Cold case investigators began meticulously retracing the original investigation. They combed through old reports, revisited physical evidence, and, perhaps most critically, tracked down and re-interviewed witnesses from the 1980s. Over an 11-month period, the team interviewed 32 people connected to the case, effectively reliving the investigation step by step. The passage of time had not weakened the witnesses' memories or their resolve. Remarkably, all of their statements in the present day lined up with what they had said decades earlier. Among those they spoke to was the very same informant from 1986. After so many years, he was still willing to tell his story. In fact, when detectives showed up at his door, the first thing he said was, "I've been waiting for you," indicating his eagerness to work with the cops. His account remained consistent with the details he'd provided back in the 80s, reinforcing that his testimony had been truthful all along. Crucially, investigators recognized that the only thing which had saved Jeremiah from being charged in the 1980s was the misplaced faith in a polygraph test. With that barrier removed, the accumulated evidence against Jeremiah became overwhelming. By late 2025, Rhode Island authorities were ready to declare Deborah Stone's case solved at last. Attorney General Peter Nerona publicly announced that investigators had concluded Robert Jeremiah was the person responsible for Deborah's death. The reopened investigation had pieced together a compelling narrative of what happened. Deborah was strangled to death in Jeremiah's apartment, and her body was secretly transported and dumped in the narrow river shortly thereafter. According to the cold case unit, there was now more than enough evidence to have charged Jeremiah with Deborah's slaying and likely win a conviction in court. Of course, this last piece is a bittersweet victory at best, since Jeremiah would never face justice for his crimes. I've got some thoughts on this case since it just doesn't sit right with me. Looking back at the way investigators handled Robert Jeremiah in the mid-1980s, it's hard not to feel a deep sense of disbelief. Here was a man openly dealing drugs, whispered to have mob ties, and directly linked to the last confirmed moments of Deborah Stone's life. Yet he was never arrested, never charged, and barely pressured. The fact that police let him walk away at a moment when the case was still warm has always raised uncomfortable questions. Detectives had an informant willing to implicate both himself and Jeremiah, offering specific, non-public details about the disposal of Deborah's body. They had Jeremiah's shifting explanations, his suspiciously casual claim that she must have overdosed, and an autopsy that clearly contradicted that. But instead of building on the momentum, investigators stopped cold after one failed polygraph. Notably, while polygraphs weren't as discredited as they are today, they were still a highly controversial investigative tool even back in the 80s. It's impossible to ignore the broader context. This was an era when organized crime had significant influence in parts of Rhode Island. No one has ever proven corruption in Deborah's case, but the optics are undeniably troubling. A mob-connected dealer avoids arrest, despite being the last person seen with a woman who ended up strangled and hidden in a weighted sleeping bag. At best, it was a catastrophic investigative misjudgment. At worst, it hints at forces operating behind the scenes. It was 2 a.m. in the quiet of Mule Creek State Prison. This wasn't the main cell block, but one of the private apartment-like units reserved for the prison's family visit program. An inmate, 54-year-old David Brinson, used a phone to call correctional officers, reporting a medical emergency. His wife, he claimed, had passed out. Prison fire department staff responded, attempting life-saving measures, but it was too late. Within the hour, 62-year-old Stephanie Dowles was pronounced dead. Brinson's call was the start of a cover-up. What appeared to be a tragic medical event was, in reality, a killing. And it wasn't the first time this had happened. In fact, it wasn't even the first time that year. Stephanie was visiting her husband David Brinson at the time, but he wasn't just any inmate. He was a notorious killer, convicted in the 1990s for the execution-style slayings of 4 men during a robbery in Los Angeles. His sentence was absolute, 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was a man the state of California had legally determined was beyond rehabilitation. Yet, he was granted the privilege of a multi-day, unmonitored visit with his wife in a private unit. Stephanie's family's confusion was profound. They couldn't understand how, given Brinson's violent history, he was ever eligible for such a visit in the first place. The investigation into Stephanie's November 2024 death was slow, and for months it was shrouded in silence. Brinson's initial report that Stephanie had passed out from a medical event was, at least for a time, the prevailing narrative. The prison and the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, or CDCR, released no public information. The breakthrough came not from a confession, but from the methodical work of the Amador County Coroner's Office. In March 2025, 4 long months after her death, the coroner's findings were finally made public. Stephanie's death was caused by strangulation. Brinson's lie was exposed. The Amador County District Attorney's Office, led by Todd Reby, had to wait for the prison's own complete investigation before filing charges. Finally, on August 14, 2025, 9 months after Stephanie was slain, Brinson was formally charged. The delay and the official silence were devastating, but what Stephanie's family and the public didn't know was that the CDCR was already sitting on a dark secret. Stephanie Dowles wasn't the first woman slain in the Mule Creek family visiting units that year. She was the second. 4 months earlier, in July 2024, 47-year-old Tanya Thomas arrived at the same prison for a 4-day, 3-night visit with her partner, Anthony Curry. The circumstances of her death are a chilling echo of Stephanie's. On the morning of July 1st, 2024, Curry used the intercom in the visiting unit to call correctional staff, reporting that his partner was having a medical emergency. Tanya Thomas was found unconscious and pronounced dead. Like Brinson, Curry was a violent offender serving a life sentence. And just like Stephanie's case, the coroner's report on Tanya would later confirm the cause of death was strangulation. 2 violent inmates serving life sentences, 2 identical quote-unquote medical emergency alibis, and 2 strangulations. This wasn't a tragic, isolated incident. It was a pattern. The slayings of Stephanie Dowells and Tanya Thomas exposed a stunning and paradoxical flaw at the heart of California's family visit program. California is one of only a handful of states that still allows these extended overnight visits, often called conjugal visits. Notably, these visits place the privacy of the couple above security, a fact that has now come under heavy criticism. As of now, David Brinson remains charged but not yet convicted of killing Stephanie Dowells. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you to subscribe and hit the notification bell and turn on all those notifications. Also remember to check out the membership option by clicking join or hit the Patreon link in the description. On the morning of July 20th, 2019, a Lafayette County deputy was on a routine patrol when he stumbled upon a scene that was anything but routine. At an abandoned, desolate fishing camp near Sardis Lake, Mississippi, he found a body. The location was remote, some 30 miles from the bustling campus of the University of Mississippi, commonly known as Ole Miss. The victim, found near a picnic table, was quickly identified as 21-year-old Alexandria Costial, a student at the university. Her purse and IDs were found nearby, ruling out robbery. Foul play was immediately apparent. Allie, as she was known to her friends, had been shot multiple times. Investigators on the scene were struck by the sheer brutality. She had been shot at least 9 times. This wasn't a random act of violence. This level of overkill was personal, pointing to a perpetrator driven by a deep, volatile rage. The discovery sent a shockwave through the community. Allie Costial was well liked and respected. A native of St. Louis, Missouri, she was a senior staying in Oxford to take summer classes. She was ambitious and bright, studying marketing with dreams of working in the fashion industry. On campus, she was a leader, teaching yoga and Pilates, and founding the student golf club. Investigators moved quickly to Allie's apartment, searching for any clue that could explain her final hours. They hit an immediate roadblock. Her cell phone was missing. It was a clear attempt by the perpetrator to erase their digital connection and any record of their final communications. But the killer made a critical technological mistake. In his haste to destroy the phone, he'd forgotten something. On her bedside table, police found Allie's Apple Watch. Even with the phone gone, her most recent text messages had synced to the watch. The watch, in effect, became the prosecution's star witness. It provided investigators with a digital map of Allie's life and her anxieties, and it offered up a single, strong, and immediate lead. The last person Allie had been in contact with, the person her final messages were with, was a 22-year-old fellow student named Brandon Thiesfeld. But the watch didn't just provide a name, it provided a motive. The text logs revealed what investigators called life-changing news. For the past 3 months, Allie had been communicating with Thiesfeld about a terrifying possibility. She was concerned she might be pregnant. Because of that simple synced device, this case was never a whodunit. Within hours of finding Allie's body, police had a primary suspect and the quote-unquote problem he desperately wanted to solve. Allie and Brandon Thiesfeld first met in 2016. Their relationship, however, was a complicated one. Friends described it as an on and off affair, but they were never an official couple. Allie was clearly more attached to him than he was to her, an attachment that confused her friends, who said Thiesfeld treated her poorly and sent her rude text messages. Thiesfeld's reputation on campus matched this private behavior. A former dorm neighbor described him in no uncertain terms as extremely arrogant. Thiesfeld constantly referenced his father's money and bragged that his dad could get him out of anything. This was the man Allie turned to in April 2019 when she feared she was pregnant. She texted him her concerns and even sent a photo of an inconclusive home pregnancy test. His reaction was immediate and cold. He messaged her that he wasn't ready to become a parent and that becoming a father would ruin his life. For the next 3 months, Allie tried to do what any reasonable person would. She tried to meet with him in person to discuss what to do. But Thiesfeld refused. He avoided her, canceling plans at the last minute. This digital-only relationship gave him all the power. He could ignore her, and she had no recourse. Her desperation for a simple, face-to-face conversation would become her greatest vulnerability. As the prosecution would later argue, Thiesfeld didn't just see this as a difficult situation. It wasn't just the potential child. It was Allie herself, the inconvenience that threatened his consequence-free lifestyle. Tragically, this entire motive was based on a fear, not a confirmed fact. An autopsy, and a later admission from Thiesfeld's own defense attorney, would confirm the awful irony. Allie Kostial wasn't pregnant at any point. After Allie's initial texts in April, his Google search history showed him looking up ways to end a pregnancy without her knowing. He was looking for a simple solution. But by July, his mindset had shifted from ending a pregnancy to ending a life. On July 12th, Allie texted him again, this time with photos of 2 more ambiguous pregnancy tests. This appears to have been the trigger. That same day, Thiesfeld drove from Mississippi to his home in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He returned with a pistol, a weapon that had been purchased by his father. His internet searches became sinister. He was no longer looking for pills. He was researching silencers, suppressors, and ammunition types. Most disturbingly of all, he made a bunch of searches about Ted Bundy and wanted to find insights into how he lured his victims. Also, perhaps this doesn't bear mentioning, but I found it to just reveal what an arrogant amateur this idiot actually was. He also searched up, quote, what button does what on a Glock? For all his dark fantasies, he didn't even know how to use his weapon of choice. The plan was put into motion on the night of July 19th, 2019. Allie's evening began normally. Prosecutors later claimed that he had taken inspiration from Ted Bundy in committing his own crime, deciding to disarm Allie with charm. At 7 that night, she had a happy phone call with her mother, Cindy. They had just spent time decorating her apartment for the upcoming school year, and Allie was excited. She told her mom she'd just woken from a nap and was planning to go out with friends. Surveillance footage confirmed she did just that. At 11:52 p.m., cameras captured Allie leaving a bar called Funky's in Oxford Square. She was safe. Just minutes later, at 11:57 p.m., video shows her getting into an Uber alone. She arrived at her apartment safely around midnight. But sometime after she got home, the trap was sprung. She received the one message she had been waiting 3 months for. Brandon Thiesfeld had finally agreed to meet. Around 1:28 a.m., security footage and phone data show Thiesfeld's truck pulling up to her apartment. Believing she was finally going to get the face-to-face conversation she so desperately needed, Allie voluntarily got in his truck. But according to Brandon, this wasn't to be a discussion for an apartment parking lot, and he suggested they take a drive. Unfortunately, Allie trusted Thiesfeld and she went along with him. Thiesfeld drove her 30 minutes away from campus, away from the town, to the pre-selected abandoned fishing camp at Sardis Lake. Phone data from both Allie and Thiesfeld pinged at that remote location at the time of the shooting. There, he shot her and dumped off her body. Just hours later, the deputy on patrol would find her body. Thiesfeld's plan unraveled almost immediately, thanks to the Apple Watch. When investigators called him for questioning, he kept making excuses, promising to come in on Monday. He never intended to. On Monday, July 22nd, when he failed to appear, police, who had already obtained an affidavit, began tracking his cell phone. He was fleeing. The data showed him driving north toward Memphis, Tennessee. Authorities issued an alert for his pickup truck. It was easy to identify, thanks to its arrogant custom vanity plate which read, "Take it." He was arrested without incident at a Memphis gas station, and dashcam video captured the end of his short run. Unsurprisingly, he wasn't quite as tough when he was confronted by police. Either that or his self-preservation instinct kicked in. The evidence he was caught with was overwhelming. He still had blood on his clothes. Inside his truck, the cops found his dad's Glock, which was a match for the shell casings found at the crime scene. The case was sealed, but there was one more piece. Back in his apartment, police found a letter he'd written to his parents that weekend. Prosecutors called it a confession. In it, he wrote, quote, "I've always had terrible thoughts, blaming them on substance usage." He apologized for them and said that he was either going to die on the run or end up in jail for life, a prediction which would have been prophetic if it wasn't so obvious. In August 2019, a grand jury indicted Brandon Thiesfeld on capital offense charges. The charge rested on the allegation that he had kidnapped Allie by luring her to the lake under false pretenses. He was facing the death penalty, and despite the overwhelming evidence, he initially pled not guilty. After significant delays due to the events of 2020, the case came to a pragmatic conclusion. He agreed to life without parole in an effort to spare his own life and with the potential for a conditional release when he's 65 years old. Personally, I think having spent your entire adult life in prison and then being turned out to the world at age 65 sounds like another level of punishment entirely. In court, Thiesfeld, who had reportedly shown no emotion for 2 years, broke down during sentencing. He read a statement to Allie's family, saying he was, quote, "sincerely sorry for the pain he'd caused, that there is no excuse for his actions." Allie's family responded with a victim impact statement, read in court by the assistant district attorney. Her mother, Cindy, wrote that their lives had been shattered by her loss. Thiesfeld's own mother, in a separate statement, said she was disturbed that her son didn't share his inner demons with his family. She urged other parents to have a talk with their own children about their deepest, darkest secrets, which, given the context of what kind of guy Thiesfeld was, I find questionable. His parents had clearly raised an affluenza-style kid who was being handed everything, so their cautionary tale is much deeper than having a little talk now and then. In the sprawling, sun-drenched suburbs of Clermont, Florida, manicured lawns often conceal the quiet desperations of the families living within them. On Sandy Pines Road, a 5-acre property sat under the heavy, humid air of central Florida, appearing to the outside world as a slice of semi-rural paradise. But beneath the surface, quite literally, lay a secret encased in concrete and buried under the ashes of a fire pit. It was here, in March 2018, that the facade of Lori Shaver's life finally cracked. For nearly 3 years, She had lived on this property with her children and a new partner, hosting parties and building a future. Little did they know this was all occurring while the decomposing remains of her husband, Michael Shaver, lay just feet beneath the soles of her shoes. The discovery of Michael's body launched a legal saga involving digital impersonation, a wedding held over a grave, and a defense strategy that left a courtroom gasping. This is a story about the lengths to which a person will go to curate a reality, and the chilling ability to maintain a lie while literally building a life on top of the truth. Michael Shaver was a monorail technician at Walt Disney World, a job requiring precision and reliability. By all accounts from his co-workers, Michael was a man of routine. He showed up and got the job done. In the ecosystem of Disney's transportation network, he was a known quantity. He married Lori, his high school sweetheart. They met in the 7th grade, a detail Lori would later reminisce about on the witness stand. To the casual observer, they were a typical family unit. Yet, the fissures were forming long before the fatal shot. The transformation of a childhood romance into a lethal trap suggests a slow erosion of trust, replaced by a toxicity that would eventually consume them both. The timeline of the tragedy anchors itself in November 2015. Michael Shaver simply stopped showing up. His co-workers at Disney were the first to notice. Then came the text message. A message sent from Michael's phone stated abruptly that he was quitting and that they could, quote, keep all his tools. For a technician, tools are a livelihood, an investment of thousands of dollars. To abandon them was to abandon one of his biggest investments. The message raised immediate red flags. It was a chaotic gesture attributed to a steady man. Simultaneously, Michael's family felt the chill of his absence. When they reached out, they received hostile texts or Facebook messages from Michael's account. He told them to leave him alone, and a narrative of a disgruntled husband fleeing domesticity for a fresh start quickly formed and would be accepted by everyone for a time. However, if Michael had truly left to begin a new life, he would need cold, hard cash. Yet his bank accounts remained frozen. There was no withdrawal of funds, no credit card activity, no digital footprint of a man moving through the world. There was only the digital phantom, typing angry messages from an IP address that traced back to his own home, where he apparently no longer was. I guess Lori didn't know about VPNs. It was a different time. Between November 2015 and February 2018, Lori Shaver lived 2 lives. Prosecutors argued this was clear evidence of her consciousness of guilt. She began dating, eventually moving a new man, Travis Filmer, into the home she had shared with Michael. She told people Michael was a deadbeat, a stalker, or in jail. The cruelty of the impersonation was most acute in how it targeted Michael's family. As they grew desperate for proof of life, the responses from Michael became more biting. When his mother grew gravely ill, the messages remained cold. To maintain the lie, Michael had to be such a jerk that no one would care to look for him. Within months of Michael's supposed departure, Lori began a relationship with Travis Filmer. Filmer testified that Lori told him Michael was, quote, no longer walking this earth, and that something bad had happened. This admission suggests Lori felt a level of security that she would not be caught. The construction of the fire pit and the pouring of the concrete slab became a focal point of this new era. At the trial, Travis Filmer admitted to helping construct this feature, citing practical reasons like a muddy backyard. Yet, the timing was damning. The slab was a seal, a permanent lid placed over the volatile history of the marriage. In December 2016, Lori and Travis held a commitment ceremony on the property. Lori wore a white dress, Travis's grandfather walked her down the aisle. It was a celebration of the new life, held directly over the remains of the old one. The charade collapsed in February 2018. A childhood friend of Michael's requested a well-being check, reporting that no one had heard Michael's voice in 3 years. This was despite getting barraged with odd and aggressive messages from him throughout this entire time. When Lake County deputies arrived, Lori stuck to her script. Michael had left in 2015. She allowed them inside the house, which betrayed no signs of a struggle. However, when deputies asked to search the backyard with a sniffer dog, Lori's cooperation evaporated. At that point, she requested an attorney and shut down completely, proving that there was definitely nothing a dog would find in that backyard. And honestly, it would have been better for her to just not cooperate at all. Being totally willing to deal with investigators until they wanted to sniff around the backyard, literally with a dog, is obviously a very bad look. On March 9, 2018, the sheriff's office returned with a warrant and a team of German shepherds. A canine from the Brevard County Sheriff's Office alerted on the fire pit area, jumping and digging before sitting down, the signal for decomposition. Deputies broke through the concrete slab. Beneath the earth, they found a blue tarp. As the layers of soil were peeled back, the reality of Michael Shaver's final resting place was revealed. The fire pit was a sarcophagus. The trial of Lori Shaver began in September 2024, 9 years after Michael took his last breath. The state painted Lori as a black widow who killed her husband to start over, using digital impersonation to hide the crime. But the defense, led by attorney Jeffrey Wiggs, chose a strategy almost unheard of in criminal defense: blame the child. I call this the "Who Shot Mr. Burns" defense, and yeah, this is clearly a Hail Mary pass at best. First, the defense dismantled the victim. They painted Michael not as a good-natured Disney technician, but as a violent monster. They argued his disappearance was the result of a violent confrontation gone wrong. The crux of the defense was a claim that sucked the air out of the courtroom. Lori didn't kill Michael. Her daughter Isabel did. The defense theorized that in 2015, Michael was attacking Lori to the point of potentially killing her. Isabel, then 7 years old and quick on the draw, allegedly ran to get a revolver and heroically shot her father to save her mother. The defense further claimed that after the child fired, Lori's ex-lover, a man named Jeremy Townsend, took the gun, fired a second shot to finish him off, and disposed of the body. Isabel Shaver, now 15, walked to the stand and told a harrowing story. She described a chaotic scene where her father was kicking her mother. She claimed Jeremy Townsend was present and fired a second shot. It was a dramatic confession, but the prosecution dismantled it with forensic logic. The medical examiner testified that Michael died from a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. There was no evidence of a second shot. This single fact devastated the defense's two-shooter theory. Prosecutors pointed out that Isabel had been interviewed multiple times over the years and never mentioned shooting her father until the trial. They suggested she had been manipulated or groomed by her mother into taking the fall, knowing that she couldn't be found criminally liable as a 7-year-old. Jeremy Townsend testified for the prosecution, likely under immunity or simply to clear his name. Townsend stated that he didn't even know who Michael was. He denied being at the house, shooting Michael, or burying the body. He testified his relationship with Lori didn't begin until December 2015. Importantly, this was a month after the slaying, making the timeline simply not work. Travis Filmer, the man who married Lori on the slab, was a reluctant witness. He admitted to pouring the concrete but claimed ignorance of what lay beneath. When prosecutors asked why he didn't ask questions when Lori hinted there was something more there, his lack of curiosity painted a picture of willful blindness. He just wasn't a very inquisitive guy, he claimed. The jury was left with two competing realities, with the first being a calculated wife who executed her husband and impersonated him for years. The other potential reality involved a 7-year-old Annie Oakley who saved her mom's life and a boyfriend from the future who solved all her problems. The physical evidence, the single gunshot, the digital deception, the concrete slab, weighed heavily against the defense. On a Friday in September 2024, after approximately 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty. Sentencing occurred on November 25, 2024. Judge Carrie Rada sentenced Lori Shaver to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Lori Shaver is perhaps one of the most evil people I've covered on this channel, given the sheer scope of the psychological damage she inflicted as well. She didn't just kill Michael, she went above and beyond to damage everyone in her orbit, including, most disturbingly, her own daughter. On the evening of March 1st, 2017, a peaceful rural Pennsylvania setting was shattered by a gunshot. 22-year-old Katrina Seaburn, a Clarion University senior, was found fatally shot in her car near Lake Lucy in Washington Township. This is the story of how a young woman's life was cut short and how the investigation, trial, and conviction of her boyfriend, Damian Ditz, eventually brought answers and justice. It started as a routine drive on that early March evening. Katrina Seaburn, a 22-year-old student from Curwensville, sat in the passenger seat of her Suzuki hatchback, while her boyfriend, 22-year-old Damian Ditz, drove. A Glock had been resting on the dashboard since the night before, after the couple had gone on a fishing trip. As they pulled into the parking area of a trailer park near Lake Lucy, a 911 call came in at 5:43 reporting a shooting. First responders arrived to a grim scene. Katrina had been shot once in the chest and was unresponsive. Paramedics couldn't save her. She was pronounced dead at the scene, still buckled in the front passenger seat of her car. Ditz appeared immediately distraught. Witnesses later recounted that he was found outside the vehicle in extreme distress, vomiting and sobbing as emergency personnel arrived. He was even heard screaming that it, quote, should have been me. An apparent raw display of shock and remorse in the moments after the shooting. Aside from the dying victim and Ditz himself, no one else was present. It fell to the Pennsylvania State Police and Clarion County detectives to piece together what had happened between the couple in those fateful minutes. In the immediate aftermath, Ditz told police that the shooting was a bizarre accident. During an interview with the cops on the night of March 1st, he claimed the loaded Roscoe had slid off the dashboard as he made a turn. As it fell, it hit the center console and discharged on its own, striking Katrina square in the chest. Within hours, he changed his story. In a second statement that same night, Ditz said that when the gun slid off the dash, he grabbed for it, and it went off as he caught it. Both versions painted the incident as an unfortunate mishap, with Ditz denying any intent to harm his girlfriend. Despite these explanations, troopers weren't entirely convinced, but they decided not to file charges immediately, pending further analysis of the evidence. Over the next 3 months, investigators dug deeper, and a possible motive emerged. The couple had been arguing over money that day. Katrina had lent Ditz about $1,000 to buy a car, and he had in turn given some of it to a friend, which upset her. Shortly before the shooting, Katrina checked Ditz's bank balance at an ATM and discovered only $9 remaining, a finding that sparked a heated dispute in the car. This ultimately very minor financial feud provided context for why emotions were running high just before the weapon discharged. Katrina and Ditz had dated on and off for about 4 years, so those close to them struggled to fathom how an ordinary disagreement escalated into a deadly incident. On June 20th, 2017, after extensive investigation, state police brought Ditz back in for a polygraph examination and intensive questioning. Confronted with the inconsistencies in his stories and other evidence, Ditz changed his account yet again. He admitted that his previous statements were false. Ditz now confessed that during the argument over the missing cash, he lost his temper and grabbed the weapon in anger. Despite knowing it was loaded, he pointed the Glock at Katrina to intimidate her, and then, without warning, it went off, and the bullet fatally struck her in the chest. Ditz insisted he didn't intentionally pull the trigger, claiming the firearm discharged while he was irresponsibly waving it around. Following this confession, authorities arrested Ditz on criminal homicide and related charges. And I'll just add here that if he had simply stuck to one of his initial stories, it looks like this guy may have actually gotten away with it. Thankfully, Damien was engaging in some nominative determinism and lived up to his Ditz name, being unable to keep his story straight. In December 2018, Damien Ditz went on trial at the Clarion County Courthouse. The proceedings lasted about 1 week and drew intense local interest. Early in the trial, testimony had to be paused when Ditz suffered an apparent panic attack in the courtroom. Once the trial resumed, the core question was clear. Both sides agreed. Ditz fired the gun, but whether it was an accident or not would determine Damien's fate. District Attorney Mark Aaron argued that this shooting was no accident. In his opening statement, he told the jury that by picking up a loaded weapon during a heated argument with a finger on the trigger, Ditz demonstrated an extreme disregard for human life. Such reckless behavior, Aaron contended, amounted to malice. To reinforce a motive, the prosecution recounted the couple's dispute over the money, suggesting that seething anger had overtaken Ditz. The jury was shown surveillance footage from a bank drive-thru earlier that afternoon, where Katrina can be seen checking Ditz's account shortly before the incident. Investigators also presented the physical evidence, the Glock itself and a box of ammunition from the car. A trooper testified that the ammo box had 1 round missing, presumably the bullet that felled Katrina. Additionally, Ditz's cousin, the weapon's owner, testified that the Glock had never malfunctioned in its prior use. This potentially undermined any claim of a spontaneous misfire, though no expert evidence appears to have been led in this regard. The defense maintained that Katrina's death was a tragic accident and nothing more. Defense attorney Adam Bishop acknowledged that Ditz caused the fatal shot, but urged jurors to see it as the result of negligence, not intent. He portrayed Ditz as inexperienced and foolish with firearms, but not a killer. He was a stupid person, not a malicious person. The defense emphasized that Ditz had no reason to deliberately harm the woman he loved. They pointed out that the young couple had shared hopeful plans for the future. They even kept a bucket list of goals like getting engaged and buying a house, and nothing in Ditz's background suggested malice toward Katrina. All evidence of his panic and grief after the incident, they argued, was consistent with someone horrified by his own mistake. The most dramatic testimony came from Ditz himself. Taking the stand in his own defense, he broke down and reiterated that he never meant to do this to Katrina. He admitted he handled the gun recklessly and expressed profound remorse. However, under cross-examination, Ditz had to confront his shifting stories. When pressed about the moment the weapon fired, he ultimately conceded that he had pulled the trigger, an extremely damaging admission that undermined his accident narrative. This acknowledgement gave credence to the prosecution's claim that whatever his regrets afterward, Ditz's actions in that instant were criminally reckless. After closing arguments, the case went to the jury. The prosecutor stressed that waving a loaded gun at someone in anger is not a simple mishap. The defense, in turn, pleaded for jurors to recognize Ditz's lack of intent and genuine remorse, suggesting he should be convicted of involuntary manslaughter at most. The panel of 7 women and 5 men began deliberations, tasked with determining what form of punishment suited this situation. On December 7, 2018, the jury returned its verdict after nearly 4 hours of deliberation. They found Damien Ditz guilty of negligent homicide in the death of Katrina Seaburn. The verdict meant the jurors concluded Ditz acted with malice, that he intentionally or knowingly caused death through his reckless actions. But they stopped short of saying that he committed the act willfully and declined to find him guilty in the first degree. 6 weeks later, on January 23, 2019, Ditz faced his sentencing hearing. A standing-room-only crowd filled the courtroom, including dozens of Katrina's family members and friends wearing Justice for Katrina shirts emblazoned with her photo. Emotions ran high as loved ones spoke. Katrina's mother, Tammy Seaburn, delivered a heart-wrenching statement about the impact of losing her only child. She described Katrina as a gifted student and athlete, a young woman who had excelled in school and was just weeks from graduating college. All of those achievements and future milestones, Tammy noted, were stolen in an instant. She recounted how her life and family were shattered on that day in 2017, and how every day since has been a struggle with grief. Pleading for the maximum punishment, she urged the judge to take a firm stand against violence so that no other mother would have to endure what she has. Ditz, given a chance to speak, sobbed as he apologized and insisted he never wanted to hurt Katrina. Judge James Arner, before announcing the sentence, acknowledged that no outcome could truly compensate for the loss of a life. He then sentenced Damien Ditz to 10 to 20 years in state prison. This punishment ensured that Ditz would spend at least a decade behind bars before being eligible for parole. It was less than the 40-year maximum that Katrina's family had hoped for, but it held Ditz accountable for his actions to a significant degree. The conclusion of the court case brought some closure, but little comfort to those who loved Katrina. However, personally, I think the result is about as good as it could have possibly been given the circumstances. If Ditz had simply stuck to his initial story, there would have been little way to disprove it, especially if he went with the second story, where he grabbed the trigger accidentally. The night was cold and quiet on February 6, 2021, in the East Rock neighborhood of New Haven, Connecticut, a place typically synonymous with academia. Yale University student Kevin Jiang was driving home, about a week after the happiest moment of his life. At 26, he was a dedicated graduate student in the Yale School of the Environment, a former Army National Guard officer, and a man whose life was deeply anchored in faith and service. Just 1 week earlier, Kevin had become engaged to Zion Perry, a fellow Yale doctoral candidate in molecular biophysics and biochemistry. They were a couple built on shared values, scholarship, and commitment. That Saturday, Kevin and Zion had spent the day indulging in nature, hiking and ice fishing, before sharing dinner at her apartment. When Kevin left her home around 8:30 p.m. in his Toyota Prius, intending to drive the short distance to his own residence, he couldn't have anticipated the violence awaiting him. He barely made it 2 blocks. At the intersection of Lawrence and Nickel Streets, Kevin's car was struck from behind by a dark SUV. At first, this seemed to be nothing more than a minor fender bender. This common, low-stakes interaction was, in fact, an ingeniously designed trap, an intentional setup that guaranteed Kevin would leave the safety of his vehicle. As he stepped out, likely to check on the other driver and exchange insurance information, the facade of an accident vanished. The driver of the SUV pulled a gun and, in an act of staggering brutality, opened fire. The noise shattered the quiet academic streetscape, marking the end of Kevin Jiang's vibrant life in a volley of bullets. The crime scene itself immediately suggested this was no random act of road rage. Witnesses reported hearing the minor collision, followed by a torrent of gunshots. One witness saw muzzle flashes and noted that the shooter, dressed all in black, continued to fire bullets into the victim after he had already fallen. Kevin Jiang was struck a devastating 8 times. The proximity of some shots was so close that gunpowder left burn marks on his face. A chilling home surveillance video captured Kevin's final moments alive, confirming the swift and clinical execution described by witnesses and the powder marks. Detectives from the New Haven Police Department quickly gathered the physical evidence, including the 8 spent casings. Here, the case deepened considerably. Ballistic analysis linked those casings not just to a single incident, but to 4 recent non-fatal drive-by shootings. They had all occurred in the immediate area in the months leading up to the killing. At every non-fatal scene, 1 to 5 casings were recovered, all linked to this weapon. The emerging understanding of the evidence revealed a much more sinister truth. The shooter hadn't acted randomly. He had laid a meticulous, multi-stage plan, staging the prior shootings as decoys to mislead police into concluding that Kevin's death was merely part of a random string of violence. This strategic use of pre-crime suggested a perpetrator whose intelligence and planning extended far beyond typical offenders. It pointed to a motive that was highly personal and targeted, despite the perpetrator's attempt to construct a misleading narrative of randomness. The investigative focus soon shifted from the seemingly random nature of the ballistic evidence to the dark vehicle used in the attack. The vehicle used in all the crimes were 2013 GMC Terrains, which the perpetrator had taken out for test drives. For the vehicle he used to eliminate Kevin, he just straight up stole the vehicle during his test drive. The perpetrator had executed a careful deception. Around 11 a.m., he'd persuaded a salesman to let him take the SUV for an extended test drive. He claimed he needed to bring it to his mechanic for inspection before purchasing it. The salesman attached a dealer license plate, believing the arrangement to be legitimate. When the salesman called later that afternoon, the driver asked for more time, citing a fabricated family emergency, then stopped responding altogether. By 5:30 p.m., the car was reported stolen. The vehicle was eventually found abandoned on railroad tracks in North Haven, Connecticut, shortly after the final shooting. The chain of evidence, the stolen car, the specific caliber weapon, and the orchestrated decoy shootings quickly led investigators to the individual who had stolen the SUV. This was Chin Xuan Pan, a 29-year-old Massachusetts Institute of Technology researcher. Pan, who had received his bachelor's in computer science in 2013, was working as a researcher at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. Notably, he had been described as a genius by virtually all that had met him, but he had severe difficulties socializing. Authorities moved swiftly, naming Pan as a suspect on February 10, 2021, and issuing a warrant for his arrest on February 26th for the attacks and the vehicle theft. Pan was considered armed and dangerous, having vanished almost instantly after his deranged spree. The moment Pan was identified, detectives began exploring his link to the victim, Kevin Jiang. The connection led not to Kevin, but to his fiancée, Zion Perry. Both Pan and Perry had attended MIT, where they were acquaintances. Perry received her bachelor's degree in bioengineering from MIT the year prior. The two had crossed paths multiple times and had even been photographed together multiple times. However, the actual extent of their interaction was minimal. Perry stated they had never had a romantic relationship and that they barely knew each other. When Perry graduated, Pan had asked to video call her to congratulate her, an invitation she politely declined. Despite this minimal contact, detectives concluded that Pan had cultivated a severe obsession with Perry. This delusion, unknown to both Perry and Jiang, was likely triggered by the one piece of public information that shattered Pan's self-constructed fantasy. The announcement of Kevin and Zion's engagement on Facebook 1 week prior to the killing must have utterly destroyed his delusional worldview. Though the official motive was never fully confirmed by prosecutors during the legal process, the circumstantial evidence strongly points toward extreme, obsessive jealousy. Pan's highly premeditated actions, stealing a vehicle hours earlier and staging multiple decoy attacks, suggest he wasn't reacting impulsively. He was executing a plan devised specifically to eliminate the man who was living what he believed should have been his own reality. However, the fact that he started his series of decoy attacks before the Facebook post throws a wrench in this theory, in my view. At any rate, we'll never know the truth, for reasons which are about to become apparent. Pan's calculated planning didn't end at the scene. He had prepared extensively for life on the run. Shortly after abandoning the stolen vehicle, he changed his cell phone number and began a cross-country flight. The Marshal's Service was quickly enlisted to spearhead the manhunt, offering rewards for information that eventually reached $10,000. Pan was initially tracked to the suburban Atlanta, Georgia area, driving with relatives and reportedly acting strangely. Investigators recognized that Pan posed a significant flight risk, especially considering his family's reported access to large financial assets in Shanghai. The Marshals implemented a key strategy: meticulous surveillance of Pan's parents, believing that their movements and financial activities would eventually lead them to their son. Financial records showed the parents had been making large cash withdrawals, heightening the risk of Pan attempting to leave the country. This surveillance strategy finally paid off big time in May 2021, approximately 4 months after Kevin was gunned down. Investigators tracked Pan's parents south to Georgia again. During this trip, Pan's mother, Hong Huang, was observed at a hotel making a phone call using the clerk's phone. After this, she was observed attempting to delete the number that had been called. The Marshals were able to track that critical communication, which led them over 1,100 miles away to Montgomery, Alabama. Pan was located at a boarding house, living under the false name Henry Choi. When confronted by what was described as a small army of law enforcement, he surrendered peacefully, immediately admitting he wasn't Choi. The evidence found on him confirmed his intention for long-term evasion. Pan was in possession of approximately $20,000 in cash, 7 cell phones, and his dad's passport. His capture marked the culmination of countless hours of interagency cooperation across multiple states and federal agencies. Following his arrest and extradition back to Connecticut, Chin Xuan Pan was charged with a litany of crimes. In 2022, Pan's defense attorney, citing Pan as a communicative challenge, requested a mental competency exam. The attorney argued that Pan was evasive and uncooperative, providing only disjointed details about a potential second person being involved. This maneuver, which stalled the proceedings and raised questions about Pan's ability to assist in his own defense, required assessment by a state or court-appointed psychiatrist. However, state-appointed psychiatrists eventually assessed Pan, and he was ruled fit for trial in late 2022, confirming he understood the seriousness of the proceedings. Pan initially pleaded not guilty in December 2022 and maintained this position for quite some time. In February 2024, facing the prospect of a potentially devastating public trial, Pan unexpectedly changed his plea, admitting his guilt on all the charges. This crucial step was part of a plea agreement that allowed Pan's family to avoid getting caught up in the crossfire of the trial. The agreement stipulated a sentence of 35 years in prison without the possibility of probation or parole. This choice guaranteed certainty of punishment for the prosecution and provided a path to closure for the Zhang family, circumventing the trauma and unpredictability of a full courtroom battle. The final act of the legal drama occurred on April 25, 2024, when Judge Gerald Harmon formally sentenced Chin Chuan Pan to 35 years imprisonment at Cheshire Correctional Institution. This was exactly as outlined in the plea agreement, though the judge did have the ability not to agree to the terms as specified. During the hearing, several relatives and friends delivered powerful impact statements, underscoring the senseless devastation caused by the crime. Kevin's father eloquently described the vast potential lost, the bright future his son had planned, rooted deeply in faith and service. Pan, in a brief statement, offered an apology, saying he felt sorry for his actions and all the harm he had caused. Ultimately, since he pled guilty, we'll never really know what motivated Pan to commit this sick act, and I'm not even sure he fully understands it all himself. It's the worst fear a parent can face, walking into a child's room and finding nothing but a chilling absence. For the family of 15-year-old Megan Nichols, that fear materialized on a hot summer night in Fairfield, Illinois. This quiet community would soon be gripped by a mystery that lasted 4 long, agonizing years. Yet, what made this disappearance so immediately devastating wasn't just the vanishing, but the calculated quiet left behind, an intentional crime scene designed to scream, "Run away." The individual who took Megan's life employed a sophisticated psychological deflection, leveraging the tensions of teenage life to build a wall of plausible deniability. This strategy successfully stalled the investigation, transforming the search for a killer into a fruitless quest for a missing person. Megan Nichols disappeared on July 3, 2014, leaving her home in Fairfield, Illinois, under profoundly suspicious circumstances. At first glance, the evidence suggested a planned voluntary departure. A note was found, presumably authored by Megan, telling her mother that she loved her, but that she wouldn't ever find happiness at home. It went further, containing strange, cryptic language, and pleading with her mother not to look for her, because she simply didn't want to be found. This written communication, combined with footage showing Megan making a bank withdrawal on the day she vanished, suggested she had chosen to flee her small-town life. However, the perpetrator wasn't satisfied with merely leaving a note. The scene contained another, more alarming piece of evidence: Megan's personal cell phone, which had been intentionally wiped completely clean of data. This suggested a level of premeditation far beyond that of a spontaneous teenage runaway. What would later become apparent was that the effect of these calculated actions was immediately successful and would remain so for some time. By establishing a convincing runaway scenario, the individual responsible for Megan's disappearance successfully channeled the investigation into a false missing person case. This deliberate delay granted the perpetrator precious time to dispose of the body, solidify an alibi, and allow critical physical evidence to disappear. Megan's mother, Kathy Jo, immediately doubted the circumstances, reporting her daughter's absence at once and insisting her daughter hadn't simply run off. While the public was encouraged to believe in the runaway theory, investigators quickly identified a key person of interest: 18-year-old Brody Merbarger. Megan, who was 15 at the time, had been dating Merbarger, a relationship that was reportedly a source of disagreement and tension with her mother. While the sources don't exactly state what the source of the disagreement was, I don't think you have to look further than the age gap to figure out why any parent would want this stopped. The relationship offered the perfect motivational framework for the planned disappearance. Merbarger could easily tell police they had decided to run away together, leveraging the existing familial rift to support the note's contents. The critical timeline detail, however, was Merbarger's actions immediately following Megan's disappearance. Though sources suggested the couple intended to run off as a pair, Merbarger returned home alone the following morning. He provided a narrative that initially seemed to satisfy immediate questioning, allowing him to resume his life. According to him, she just decided to go it on her own, and that was apparently good enough for the investigators at the time. The case remained in limbo for more than 3 years, featured on various national true crime programs designed to raise awareness for missing persons. Investigators faced intense pressure, but the breakthrough they desperately needed didn't come until late 2017. The waiting period demonstrated how effective Merbarger's initial concealment strategy had been, allowing him to live freely while Megan was listed as missing. In December 2017, the years of searching finally yielded a devastating answer. Human remains were discovered in a rural area of Wayne County, Illinois, on a farm. The discovery was initially described as a human skull and bones, which appeared to have been placed in a shallow grave and potentially wrapped in a blanket. A month later, authorities confirmed the identity. The remains belonged to Megan Nichols. This grim finding irrevocably shifted the investigation, validating her mother's long-held suspicions and officially converting the case into a homicide investigation. Forensic analysis later determined the cause of death was probable asphyxiation. The nature of the concealment, a shallow grave, suggested a panicked, opportunistic effort by the killer to hide the body quickly after the crime. This lack of careful planning ultimately contributed to the remains being found years later, negating Merbarger's hope that the body would never be recovered. Once the remains were identified and the cause of death established, the investigation rapidly returned to Brody Merbarger, who by 2017 had moved on with his life. The focus immediately shifted to finding the irrefutable physical link needed for prosecution. In a move that proved decisive, investigators successfully located and searched Merbarger's vehicle, even though it had ended up in a scrapyard. This search represents a triumph of modern cold case forensics. Years after the crime, specialized forensic teams were able to recover and identify minute, trace amounts of Megan Nichols' blood from inside Merbarger's car. This physical evidence placed Megan inside his car at the time of her death or immediately afterward, providing proof that he had transported the body to the rural grave site. Furthermore, digital evidence reinforced the physical findings. Investigators successfully recovered and analyzed thousands of text messages exchanged between Merbarger and Megan. These provided a crucial window into the nature of their relationship and the events leading up to her death. Faced with overwhelming forensic and digital evidence, Merbarger was indicted by a grand jury in September 2020 on multiple felony counts. He was subsequently arrested without incident in Evansville, Indiana, awaiting extradition back to Illinois. The trial focused on the key pieces of evidence: the recovery of Megan's remains, the cause of death, the history revealed through the thousands of text messages. However, most damningly was the presence of Megan's blood inside Merbarger's vehicle and his attempts to scrub it clean. Despite the passage of time and Merbarger's initial efforts to establish a voluntary disappearance, the state successfully proved that Merbarger had intentionally killed the teenager. In October 2022, a jury found Brody Merbarger guilty in the first degree. Merbarger's attorneys attempted to challenge the verdict, filing a motion for a new trial claiming the evidence didn't align with the jury's decision. Despite this request, it was ultimately denied by the judge, who found that the evidence supported the jury's decision. In the culmination of the legal process, Brody Merbarger, by then 27 years old, returned to the courtroom for sentencing. Given the egregious nature of the crime and the calculated concealment of the body for years, the court handed down a sentence of 50 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. This final legal resolution, however, only offered a partial form of closure. During the proceedings, impact statements delivered by those close to Megan conveyed a profound sense of catharsis. This confirmed that justice, to the best extent possible within the legal system, had been delivered. Yet the pain remained palpable. Megan's mother, Kathy Jo, shared the enduring sorrow of losing not just a daughter, but her best friend. She also shared the additional trauma that was inflicted by Merbarger, concocting a false runaway scenario. This, of course, gave false hope for years that Megan may have still been alive, when, of course, the person who had orchestrated that narrative knew she wasn't. The idea that he would have kept Megan's family believing that she was alive and out of contact for the rest of their lives is just absolutely disturbing. It seems like a level of mass psychological damage added onto the crime by this killer, and I question why he would commit such a sick act. That said, I guess I shouldn't expect much better from an 18-year-old guy who was dating a 15-year-old girl and ultimately killed her. Anyway, rest in peace, Megan. You deserved so much better. Hello, my friends. It's Jimmy here with another episode of my relatively new Solved Mysteries series. So sit back and relax, leave a comment, and hit that notification bell, and turn on all those juicy notifications, and enjoy. The reality of small-town life in Wenatchee, Washington, shattered on the evening of February 9th, 2010. Mackenzie Cowell, a vibrant 17-year-old high school senior, dancer, and aspiring model, was immersed in her studies at the Academy of Hair Design. Mackenzie, who lived in nearby Orondo, told a classmate she'd return shortly as she left the beauty school, but she never came back. When her worried father, Reed Cowell, attempted to reach her around 5:40 p.m. for their scheduled dinner, her phone went straight to voicemail. With this detail, he immediately knew that something had gone terribly wrong. The ensuing search marked the catastrophic shift from a typical missing persons case to a harrowing homicide investigation that gripped the community. The family's nightmare intensified 4 days later, on February 13, 2010, when Mackenzie's body was tragically found along the banks of the Columbia River at Crescent Bar. This was about 20 miles away from the Academy of Hair Design, where she went part-time. The subsequent autopsy confirmed the worst. Mackenzie had been violently killed, suffering blunt force trauma to her head, strangulation, and stab wounds to her neck. The sheer savagery of the attack stunned even seasoned law enforcement officers, who mobilized an unprecedented multi-agency task force to pursue the perpetrator. What made the discovery particularly horrific and cemented the case as one of extraordinary brutality was the evidence of post-mortem actions. The killer had attempted to dismember the victim, trying to saw off one of her arms. One cop later went on record describing the chilling scene, noting that a knife had been left in her soft tissue, still protruding from her shoulder. This suggested that the perpetrator perhaps had significantly more plans for what he wished to do, but realized he wouldn't be able to pull off his sick fantasy. The meticulous analysis of the evidence confirmed that this was a deeply personal and pathological crime. While the cops initially thought there may have been an indecent assault, further testing revealed that this wasn't the case. However, the calculated desecration of the body indicated a desire not merely to end a life, but to exercise ultimate control and destruction over a human being. Early on, federal agents who were brought in to assist profiled the killer and suggested that he was a male with a fixation on violence and death. Also, given that there was no elements of male biological material found at the site, it wasn't necessarily a given that the perp was a man at all. This profile would anticipate the sinister revelations that would later emerge about the perpetrator's psychological state. The initial phase of the investigation quickly became mired in confusing and conflicting information, hindering the task force's progress. The first significant piece of evidence recovered was Cowell's abandoned vehicle, located near Mission Ridge, approximately 40 miles from her home. While police found her purse and some clothing inside, her cell phone and debit card were missing. Investigators noted a crucial detail at this scene. Only a single pair of footprints was found. This suggested the killer had driven the car there alone before leaving by a separate means of transport. In the absence of immediate forensic links, police initially focused on individuals within Mackenzie's personal orbit, particularly those with whom she had experienced conflict. This included her mother's boyfriend, with whom Mackenzie had reportedly engaged in a verbal conflict the day before she went missing. However, law enforcement quickly confirmed that he was completely exonerated soon into the investigation. With the investigation stalling for 2 months, a sensational, yet ultimately false narrative emerged that consumed extensive resources. A witness named Liz Reed came forward, claiming she had information about the crime. She had been a police informant, and like most police informants, was either a current or former criminal, with her being a small-time drug dealer. Reed alleged that convicted criminals and drug dealers, Sam Cuevas and Emmanuel Serros, abducted and eliminated Mackenzie in a horrifying case of mistaken identity. To bolster her claim, Reed provided police with a ring she asserted belonged to Cowell, and even claimed to have seen a videotape of the slaying. The intensive investigation into these claims demonstrated the risk of relying on unreliable informants in high-profile cases. Police informants like this have a tendency to just be gussied up and glorified jailhouse snitches, minus the jailhouse element. The physical evidence presented by Reed quickly failed scrutiny. Cowell's family didn't recognize the ring she presented, and Reed eventually retracted her account of viewing a video. Most importantly, Cuevas and Cheros provided robust alibis, backed by witness testimony and cell phone records, proving they were elsewhere when Mackenzie disappeared. Unfortunately, the time and manpower spent pursuing this deceptive lead was a significant drain on the investigation. The investigation finally pivoted 8 months after the killing, shifting from dubious witness accounts to irrefutable forensic science. A crucial tip led detectives toward Christopher Wilson, a 29-year-old classmate of Mackenzie's at the Academy of Hair Design. Investigators confirmed that Wilson was also a student there and had been seen leaving the beauty school around the same time as Cowell on the night of February 9, 2010. The definitive breakthrough came through the Washington State Patrol Crime Lab. Forensic experts successfully matched Wilson's unique DNA profile to biological material found on a piece of duct tape recovered near Mackenzie's body at the Crescent Bar disposal site. This piece of evidence proved doubly damning, as it also contained Cowell's blood. This forensic tether established a direct physical link between Wilson, the victim, and the location where her body was dumped, leading to his arrest. While Wilson had no prior criminal record, a neighbor reportedly found him to be unstable, noting that they had never felt the need to lock their doors until Wilson came to Wenatchee. Crucially, the task force served multiple search warrants, including one on Wilson's apartment, which was located close to the beauty school. Inside Wilson's residence, investigators discovered a bloodstain that lab analysis confirmed matched Mackenzie Cowell's DNA profile. The killer's DNA on the binding material used for disposal at the secondary scene, coupled with the victim's blood inside the killer's apartment, made the picture clear. It proved that Wilson didn't merely stumble upon the victim or dispose of her body after an attack. He had taken her to a location of his own choosing, specifically his apartment, where the initial, fatal assault likely took place. This discovery demonstrated that the crime was controlled, planned, and protracted, requiring Wilson to transport the body approximately 20 miles to Crescent Bar afterward. The fact that the attack originated in Wilson's private, familiar space suggested a premeditation and a level of control over the victim only capable in the safe haven of his apartment. As detectives focused on Christopher Wilson, the dark world of his hidden life began to unravel, providing a chilling psychological backdrop to the crime. Multiple individuals came forward to police, describing Wilson's intense and macabre fascination with death and serial killers. Reports confirmed he was obsessed with dead bodies and even sported a tattoo dedicated to Hannibal Lecter. Investigators concluded that Wilson's interests were more than a simple fascination. His online presence was dredged up, and he spent a significant amount of time posting disturbing content to deviant art. This was a website where users could upload their own art for viewing by the community, and it had a bit of a sketchy reputation, at least based on the YouTube videos I've watched. He also spent a significant time online reading about serial predators and posting on forums dedicated to their craft, so to speak. Notably, this is what the FBI profilers had informed the local investigators of at the start of the investigation. This dark preoccupation provided context for the specific, savage acts committed against Mackenzie, particularly the post-mortem acts. The complexity of the case grew further when the Cowell Task Force made a second arrest in December 2010. Tessa Schulman, a close friend of Wilson's, was taken into custody on suspicion of criminal assistance and obstruction. While she was eventually charged only with obstruction in an unrelated case, the evidence seized from Wilson's apartment regarding her involvement was profoundly disturbing. She initially told police she had no recollection of the events surrounding the slaying, but what happens next is incredibly disturbing. Detectives recovered images from Wilson's computers depicting Schulman posing, appearing as a deceased person with a pool of dried blood under her. This was directly on the spot in the apartment where Mackenzie Cowell's dried blood was confirmed to be present. It's unknown whether this was actually Mackenzie's blood, or if this scene was staged after, though it's strongly believed it was the original material. Additionally, videos recovered from Schulman's cell phone, recorded around the time Wilson was moving out of the apartment, documented the concealment attempt. One video showed Schulman focusing the camera on the location of the bloodstain on the rug. Another clip, recorded a few days later, captured Wilson asking her if the apartment was quote-unquote clean. She cryptically replied that it was as clean as it was going to get, considering what had happened. The act of photographing a friend posing on the victim's blood suggests that the crime extended beyond the initial attack. It became a disturbing theatrical experience for Wilson. This documentation and staging reinforced the understanding that Wilson's actions stemmed from a deep-seated psychological need to immortalize the horror he had created. Investigators speculated that he was framing it in the context of the serial killers he so avidly admired. In the spring of 2012, 2 years after the initial crime, Christopher Wilson's case was scheduled for trial. Facing overwhelming forensic evidence, the defense entered into crucial plea negotiations. In May 2012, Wilson accepted a plea agreement, pleading guilty to a reduced charge of first-degree manslaughter. He was sentenced to a term of 171 months, or just over 14 years in state prison. But despite this sweetheart deal, he wouldn't be happy. The conclusion of the legal process was instantly contentious, primarily due to Wilson's subsequent attempts to challenge his own guilty plea. He repeatedly maintained his innocence, asserting that he only accepted the plea because he felt he would not have received a fair trial in Wenatchee. Wilson claimed that during the jury selection process, He reviewed questionnaires showing that a staggeringly high proportion of prospective jurors knew about his case. Further, those that had heard about his case believed him to be guilty based on media coverage. He argued this pervasive community prejudice, fueled by intense media coverage of the crime's brutality, effectively coerced him into accepting the lesser charge. Wilson filed a motion to withdraw his guilty plea in April 2013, citing this coercion, but the motion was firmly rejected by the Washington Court of Appeals. The court determined that Wilson benefited from mitigating his sentence, and he couldn't unilaterally undo the agreement. Further, the court also framed this as being for his own protection as well, since he would have potentially been subject to life in prison. Disturbingly, Christopher Wilson was freed from the Monroe Correctional Center on December 11, 2023, having served virtually no meaningful time for ending the life of Mackenzie. The truly disturbing dimension of this case isn't just the sheer brutality inflicted upon Mackenzie Cowell. It's the chilling psychological profile of the perp. A man obsessed with death and killers, sporting a Hannibal Lecter tattoo, who executed a crime worthy of the dark narratives he idolized. But the horror of the crime clashes with the quote-unquote justice served in this case. Christopher Wilson, who subjected his classmate to such violence, walked free from prison in December 2023. Personally, I just don't get why the prosecution agreed to such minimal charges, given the strength of the evidence in this case. It leaves us with the unsettling reality that a known, self-professed devotee of depraved violence, having served his time, is now simply another face in the crowd. He's not an inmate anymore. He's someone's new neighbor, maybe yours or mine, walking free. Anyway, it's really hard to say that there was any meaningful justice for Mackenzie here. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just taking a moment to shill my Patreon and the YouTube membership. Everything you donate to the show goes directly back into production, mostly in the form of coffee and energy drinks. Imagine the most ordinary scene. A 16-year-old high school student standing outside a fast food restaurant waiting for a ride. This mundane moment, captured on a sunny afternoon in Las Vegas, Nevada, in 1979, was abruptly shattered by a monstrous act that would baffle police for 42 years. The shocking disappearance of Kim Bryant from a busy street right across from her own school illustrates how a predator can operate in plain sight. After finishing her school, Kim and a friend walked across North Decatur Boulevard to a Dairy Queen, situated near US Highway 95. Kim planned to wait there for her boyfriend to arrive and pick her up. Tragically, her friend kept going, and she vanished before that ride ever materialized. Kim was abducted in broad daylight, driven away by her killer. The brazenness of the crime, snatching a teenager from a public location directly opposite a high school, demonstrated a stunning disregard for detection by the perpetrator. Initial investigations yielded nothing definitive, and the community waited in agonizing suspense for weeks. The painful search came to an end about a month later. On February 20th, 1979, Kim's body was discovered in a desert area in the western part of the city, near the intersection of West Charleston Boulevard and South Buffalo Drive. Examination confirmed the brutality of the attack. Kim had been assaulted and slain. Reports indicated she had been beaten to death, possibly with a rock. The physical location of the discovery, on the outskirts of the growing city, suggested the killer was familiar with the remote, undeveloped expanses of Las Vegas. Investigators at the time believed he viewed these undeveloped and newly developing outskirts areas as convenient disposal sites. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, detectives exhausted every available investigative lead. In that era, law enforcement relied heavily on witness testimony, confessions, and circumstantial evidence. While investigators developed various theories and questioned multiple persons of interest, none of the traditional methods led them to the killer. The sheer passage of time, coupled with the inherent limitations of police work at the time, meant the cops struggled to identify the individual responsible for Kim's assault and death. Despite a truly massive amount of resources expended, the case eventually reached a discouraging stalemate, and the cops more or less threw in the towel. Despite this, though, one crucial piece of evidence, DNA recovered from Kim's body, was carefully preserved. Over the ensuing decades, the DNA profile was generated, but unfortunately, this did little to solve the case. His profile was uploaded to the national database, but he had either never been arrested or hadn't committed an offense serious enough to mandate DNA submission. Cold case investigators had, in essence, viewed the case as impossible to solve, and seasoned investigators didn't think it would ever get better than standard DNA testing. By the early 2020s, genetic genealogy had started to become widely available and offered a way around cases where there were no DNA hits in national databases. Recognizing the potential of this advanced method, local philanthropist and entrepreneur Justin Wu provided the financial support to have forensic testing done. This generous donation proved fundamental, acting as the catalyst necessary to breathe new life into the 4-decade-old inquiry. With the necessary funding secured, the authorities partnered with Othram, who provided significant breakthroughs to the Vegas police. Following the genealogical leads, detectives were able to focus their traditional investigation on a specific family line. Through confirmatory testing, they ultimately identified the killer as Johnny Blake Peterson. This conclusion was drawn by comparing the DNA evidence recovered from Kim's body with that of one of Peterson's family members. Johnny Blake Peterson was a Las Vegas resident, born in 1960. He was 19 years old when he committed the crime in 1979. Disturbingly, Peterson had briefly attended Western High School, the same school Kim Bryant attended, establishing a clear link to the victim's environment and the abduction site. He later married, had 2 children, and worked as a freelance plasterer. He lived the rest of his life undetected as Kim's killer. However, the confirmation of Peterson's identity came with the difficult realization that he would never face criminal prosecution. Johnny Blake Peterson had died 28 years earlier, in January 1993, at the age of 32. His death was attributed to an overdose at a local hospital. The identification of Johnny Peterson was more than just the end of the Kim Bryant case. It became the crucial opening to solving other mysteries. Almost immediately after the announcement, detectives received information suggesting Peterson's possible involvement in a second brutal cold case. Diana Hansen, 22, was a college student visiting family for the holidays when she was assaulted and stabbed to death in late December 1983. Her body was found the next day in a remote area near West Spring Mountain Road, approximately 1.5 miles from South Buffalo Drive. The location of Hansen's body, like Kim Bryant's, was situated in the undeveloped western parts of the city, suggesting a chilling consistency in the killer's methods. Detectives requested a direct comparison between the DNA evidence recovered from Diana Hansen's body and the genetic profile of Peterson. The result was definitive. The comparison confirmed that Jordan Peterson was responsible for the death of Diana Hansen as well. The confirmation of Johnny Peterson as a serial perpetrator linked to 2 deaths spanning 1979 to 1983 immediately broadened the scope of the investigation. Authorities announced they are actively reviewing at least 5 other unsolved cases in the Las Vegas area from the late 1970s and early 1980s for potential connection to Peterson. I'm absolutely convinced Jordan Peterson's victim count is much higher than just the 2 confirmed cases. We've established he killed Kim Bryant in 1979 and Diana Hansen in 1983. The 4-year gap between these two sick cases strongly suggests a continuous pattern of violent predation. It took advanced genetic genealogy to even connect him to these two. Think about that. He operated completely undetected for years until he died in 1993. The most damning evidence, though, is that the cops are already actively investigating his connection to at least 5 other Las Vegas slayings from that same era. This instantly pushes his potential victim total past 7, and we don't even know where he may have traveled to during this time period. Given he was free for over a decade after his first confirmed crime, I just can't shake the feeling that the DNA evidence will tie him to many more cold cases. Imagine the quiet terror of knowing danger is near but not knowing where it lurks. In the days leading up to April 15th, 1992, 24-year-old Lisa Ziegert, a beloved middle school teacher's aide in Agawam, Massachusetts, confided a terrible secret. She told her friends and sister that she felt like someone was watching her. That chilling premonition became horrific reality on the evening she worked her night shift alone at the Reminder Mart gift shop. Also, just a quick aside, I've covered enough cases now where someone targets a woman working alone overnight. Perhaps having anyone working overnight completely alone and dealing with the public isn't the best idea. The next morning, the store's day clerk arrived to find the shop open, the lights on, and Ziegert gone. The scene was baffling. Her car remained in the parking lot, her purse was untouched, and the cash register hadn't been raided. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It was clearly an abduction. 4 days later, on April 19th, the search ended tragically when her body was discovered in a wooded area nearby. Early investigators were able to recover crucial biological material from the scene, developing a single-source male DNA profile. The recovery of this evidence immediately signaled a strong forensic lead, yet the technology of the time rendered the information useless for immediate identification. For the next quarter century, Lisa Ziegert's slaying stood as one of the highest-profile unsolved cases in Massachusetts history. The investigative challenge wasn't a lack of evidence, but a technical wall. The male profile developed from the crime scene material was repeatedly run through state, national, and even international databases, but failed to yield a match. Despite the persistent inability to match the DNA, investigators kept the case active, ensuring that institutional knowledge about early suspects wasn't lost. This focus on long-term data retention proved critical. Just a year after the slaying, in 1993, a local man named Gary Shera had surfaced on the radar as a person of interest. He was interviewed multiple times throughout the ensuing decades. Looking back, investigators realized that Shera's behavior during a past interrogation was remarkably suspicious. He reportedly wore a long winter trench coat and gloves and went to extreme lengths to avoid touching anything in the room, keeping his hands jammed in his pockets. The investigative gridlock finally broke in 2016 when the Hampton District Attorney authorized the application of a then cutting-edge genomic technology called phenotyping. This process works by predicting an individual's ancestry and physical appearance from unidentified DNA. Using the genetic evidence recovered from the crime scene and Lisa Ziegert's remains, the authorities produced a comprehensive trait prediction for the killer. The profile indicated a white male of mixed Northern and Southern European ancestry, with a fair to very fair complexion, brown or black hair, and hazel or brown eyes. By combining these genetic attributes, the lab produced a composite sketch depicting what the suspect would have looked like at approximately age 25. The district attorney publicly released this image, announcing that investigators finally had a face associated with the crime after 24 years, generating renewed public interest and tips. The release of this rendering proved transformative. It didn't identify the killer directly, but it functioned as a powerful filter for investigators. They focused intensely on the individuals whose physical descriptions matched the genetic rendering. This technological leap, transforming genetic data into a visual lead, proved essential for narrowing the list to a manageable size, making the legal steps viable. The investigation pivoted immediately from passive database checks to aggressive, targeted legal action. A grand jury was convened to pursue court orders compelling DNA samples from the small, refined list of suspects, which included Gary Shara. On September 13, 2017, state police troopers attempted to formally notify Shara, then 48, about the legal process to obtain his sample. The simple act of notification had a devastating effect on the suspect. Realizing that the scientific noose was tightening, Shara immediately fled his home in West Springfield and went to Connecticut. His panicked flight confirmed for investigators that they had the correct man for obvious reasons. The following day brought the crucial breakthrough that secured the case before the DNA was even officially tested. An individual close to Shara contacted the state police and provided several handwritten documents purportedly authored by him. These documents contained explicit admissions to all the crimes against Ziegert, and later that day, law enforcement authorities from Massachusetts and Connecticut located Shara. Knowing he was cornered and wouldn't get away, he attempted to eliminate himself, though he was unsuccessful in this task and later apprehended. The final piece of the forensic puzzle fell into place swiftly. The DNA sample taken from Gary Shara provided a definitive 100% match to the single-source male profile recovered from Lisa Ziegert's remains 25 years earlier. With the combined weight of Shara's own handwritten confessions and the conclusive DNA evidence, the search for Lisa Ziegert's killer was officially declared over. Facing guaranteed conviction, Gary Shara ultimately pleaded guilty on September 25, 2019, securing a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Given the actions he took when he knew the gig was up, this is literally a fate worse than death for this sick puppy. On a cold February night in 1987, a small Michigan community was shaken by a crime so brutal that it would haunt investigators for decades. 30-year-old Roxanne Wood was found slain in her own kitchen, her throat slashed. For 35 years, the question of who did this to Roxanne remained unanswered, a chilling whodunit that many feared would never be solved. The case seemed unsolvable, stalled by bygone forensic limits and dead-end leads. Yet, against all odds, a tiny fragment of DNA eventually cracked the case and unmasked the cruel perpetrator. This is the story of Roxanne Wood, the decades-long quest for justice, and the extraordinary forensic breakthrough that finally brought a killer to justice. Born and raised in Niles, Michigan, Roxanne graduated high school in the 1970s and married her high school sweetheart, Terry Wood, soon after. By 1987, Roxanne was in her early 30s, enjoying life's simple pleasures. Friends and family described her as fun-loving and generous, the kind of person who made everyone feel like her best friend. She loved tending to her rose bushes in the garden and was known for sharing homemade family recipes with neighbors. On weekends, Roxanne and Terry often spent time with friends. One of her favorite songs was Bon Jovi's Wanted Dead or Alive, a fitting anthem for a spirited woman who embraced life. And normally I wouldn't have included this last little fact, but that exact song came on my rotation about 15 minutes after reading that. February 19th, 1987, began like any other day for Roxanne and Terry Wood, but it ended in unimaginable tragedy. That evening, the couple went out for dinner and then headed to their local bowling alley for a league night with friends. Since they had driven in separate cars, Roxanne left the bowling alley alone a bit earlier than Terry, planning to head home and get some rest. Sometime after Roxanne arrived home, horror struck. In the early morning hours of February 20th, Terry walked through the door of their house, only to stumble upon a blood-chilling scene. He saw Roxanne's lifeless body was sprawled on the kitchen floor, and it was evident that she had been there for some time. He frantically called 911 and conveyed the gruesome reality of the scene to the dispatchers. When police and medics arrived, it was evident that Roxanne had been brutally attacked. Investigators later determined that she had been incidentally assaulted before her throat was cut. The crime scene offered only a handful of clues. A broken frying pan was found nearby, suggesting it might have been used to bludgeon Roxanne during a struggle. Further, an empty slot in a kitchen knife block hinted that the weapon came from her own home. Notably, as the cops secured the house, a bloody kitchen knife was later discovered stashed in the freezer. Detectives also collected a biological sample from Roxanne's body and noticed a smear of blood on the outside of the back door, possibly left by the perpetrator as he fled. There were no obvious signs of forced entry into the house, raising the eerie possibility that Roxanne may have unwittingly let the man in, or that he entered through an unlocked door. The violence visited upon Roxanne in the supposed safety of her home was shocking, and the quiet neighborhood was immediately on edge knowing a predator was at large. Or at least they would have been, if they didn't all seem to believe that Terry Wood was responsible for this brutal act of violence. In cases like this, investigators often look first at those closest to the victim, and in Roxanne's case, that was her husband, Terry Wood. From the very start, Terry fell under a cloud of extreme suspicion. He was the one who found Roxanne's body, and with no forced entry, police wondered if the crime could have been an inside job. According to reports, Terry's behavior that night added to investigators' doubts. He was said to have become agitated or belligerent with first responders. Further, when brought to the station for routine questioning, he quickly asked for a lawyer. To detectives in 1987, this seemed like potentially guilty behavior, a husband trying to shield himself behind an attorney, barely an hour after his wife's slaying. Now, before I go on any further, it's extremely obvious that the cops thought Terry was their man, and they just seemed to have stopped investigating the case after they locked in on him. I'm going to tip my hand a bit here and tell you right now that Terry had absolutely nothing to do with Roxanne's slaying. It seems likely to me that Terry understood that the cops weren't asking him friendly questions in an attempt to actually solve the crime. To them, the crime was solved. Terry did it, and they just needed to break him. Under these circumstances, it makes perfect sense why Terry would want to lawyer up right away, and may have been less cooperative than usual. Indeed, one investigator bluntly told Terry that he believed that Terry had done it. Terry adamantly maintained his innocence, and Roxanne's family stood by him. Her younger sister Janet never believed Terry was capable of such a heinous act, and insisted the real perp was still out there in the shadows. Nonetheless, with no alternate suspects and scant evidence, Terry remained the primary suspect for decades in many people's eyes. Whispers followed him everywhere he went in town, and according to some reports, both investigators and locals referred to him as Slash. It was a bitter reference to a man they had believed had slain his wife. As time went on and leads dried up, it seemed like the real predator had gotten away, and an innocent man's reputation was forever marred by the loss of his wife. Despite focusing in on Terry in 1987, police were unable to charge anyone for Roxanne's slaying. The authorities only have one opportunity to take a run at their man, and the evidence just wasn't sufficient to justify attempting to do that to Terry. Aside from the physical evidence at the scene, which in those days could only be analyzed with relatively primitive forensic methods, there were no eyewitnesses and no obvious motive. The case gradually went cold, leaving Roxanne's family in limbo. By the late 1990s, DNA profiling had emerged as a game-changing tool in criminal investigations, and evidence from Roxanne's case was tested. There was DNA from the unknown offender, but even in the 1990s, there was no match in any database, and the sample was small and degraded. In 2001, Michigan State Police took a fresh look at the case, hoping new techniques might succeed where earlier efforts failed. Unfortunately, that review also ended without a breakthrough, and Roxanne's file returned to the unsolved case shelves. By 2020, over 33 years had passed since Roxanne's slaying, and technology had advanced dramatically. Michigan State Police decided to reopen the cold case once again in 2020 in a last-ditch effort to find the attacker. The turning point in this cold case arrived when detectives turned to genetic genealogy. In 2020, investigators sent what remained of the DNA sample from Roxanne's case to Identifinders International, a California-based company specializing in forensic genealogy. This was a long shot. The sample was tiny and degraded, consisting of only a few human cells worth of DNA. In fact, it was the smallest amount of DNA ever attempted for this kind of analysis, roughly 3% of the quantity normally required to build a genetic profile based on the tech at the time. They painstakingly processed the minute DNA fragments, and against the odds, they managed to extract enough genetic information to work with. It was a groundbreaking achievement in its own right. For the first time, such a low-quantity DNA sample was successfully used to generate a genealogical lead in a criminal case. One name jumped out, Patrick Wayne Gillum, a man who, as fate would have it, lived just across the state line in South Bend, Indiana, only a few miles from Niles, Michigan. Gillham had never been on the radar back in 1987, but now he was the focus of an intense investigation. Patrick Gillham was 67 years old in 2021, living a quiet life in Indiana, but detectives digging into his past quickly found red flags. Gillham had a criminal history of attacks against women. In fact, back in 1980, he had been arrested for breaking into a woman's home in Indiana and assaulting her in a chillingly similar attack. The victim in that prior case survived the ordeal and testified against him, leading to his conviction for burglary and indecent assault. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison, but ended up serving only about 7 years before being released on parole. And yeah, this just makes me shake my head and question what's wrong with our justice system. There's people who've committed nonviolent offenses, who've served less than this guy did, for committing one of the worst crimes imaginable. Unfortunately, the next time this predator struck, he would remember a twisted lesson from this crime. Don't leave behind any witnesses. Just a few months after he regained his freedom, Gillum slipped into Michigan and police believe ended the life of Roxanne Wood. Tragically, he chose to slay Roxanne after assaulting her, to ensure she could never identify him and put him behind bars again. Armed with their new suspect, Michigan State Police needed concrete proof to secure an arrest. Genetic genealogy had pointed to this potential perpetrator, but they required a direct DNA sample from him to confirm it was his DNA at the 1987 crime scene. In May 2021, an undercover surveillance team tailed Patrick Gillum for days, waiting for an opportunity to collect something he touched or discarded. They soon noticed that he was a smoker, which presented the perfect chance. A thrown-away cigarette could contain his DNA-rich saliva. One day, investigators observed Gilham flick a cigarette butt from his truck window and seized it, but that attempt hit a snag when the lab found the DNA on it wasn't a match. Reports indicate that the cop may have picked up the wrong cigarette butt. And since I'm running on a deficit of Simpsons references lately, boy, I really hope someone got fired for that blunder. Undeterred, the team tried again. A state trooper cleverly struck up a conversation with Gilham outside a laundromat, even smoking a cigarette with him to avoid arousing suspicion. He watched closely as Gilham finished his smoke and tossed the butt aside. The moment Gilham walked away, the trooper scooped up the still warm cigarette butt with gloved hands, and this time, the evidence was airtight. Lab results confirmed a perfect DNA match between him and the unknown male DNA from Roxanne's kit, conclusively tying him to the crime scene after 34 years. With the DNA match in hand, detectives moved quickly. In July 2021, they invited the perp to a police precinct under the pretense of discussing an old case, without immediately letting on that he was the prime suspect. They showed him a photo of Roxanne Wood and asked if he knew her. Gilham casually claimed he did not and soon grew uneasy, eventually saying, "I gotta talk to my lawyer." The cops bided their time a little longer to firm up the case, and on February 17th, 2022, almost exactly 35 years after Roxanne's slaying, police finally arrested Patrick Gilham. Confronted with the DNA evidence, he reportedly professed confusion, at one point telling investigators that he had no idea how his biological material could have got there. Wrong answer, Patrick. Wrong answer. However, in March 2022, rather than go through a lengthy trial, Gilham agreed to a plea deal. He pleaded no contest to second-degree slaying, which meant he did not admit guilt in words, but accepted the punishment as if he were guilty. In practical terms, a no-contest plea leads to a conviction and sentence just like a guilty plea, without the defendant explicitly saying he committed the crime. By taking this deal, he likely avoided a potential life sentence, while the prosecution reduced the risk of an adverse finding at trial. After all, the prosecution is required to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and one hiccup on cross-examination could have resulted in this guilty man walking free. At his sentencing on April 25, 2022, Patrick Gilham, then 67 years old, was ordered to serve 23 to 50 years in prison for the slaying of Roxanne Wood. Under this sentence, he will not be eligible for release until he serves at least 23 years behind bars, at which point he would be around 90 years old. In all probability, the prison cell will be where he spends the rest of his life. Unfortunately, if he had received a proper punishment for his first major crime, Roxanne would have still been alive. In court, the tearful convict offered a brief apology and said he was quote-unquote sorry and praying for forgiveness, but his words rang empty to Roxanne's family. One of Roxanne's brothers coldly remarked that it's common for people like Gilham to, quote, find Jesus only after they've been caught. He questioned why he didn't voluntarily come forward when he had the chance if he was truly so remorseful about this horrific act. The obvious answer, of course, is that he wasn't remorseful for the act, but rather the fact that he got caught yet again for committing the same sort of sick offense. Roxanne's case, once deemed unsolvable, became a landmark example of modern forensic science triumphing over time. It showed how persistence, innovative genetics technology, and old-fashioned detective work could unite to solve even the coldest of cases. Roxanne Wood's story is tragic, but it now stands as a testament that justice delayed didn't necessarily have to mean justice denied. It also sent a strong message to people out there who committed heinous offenses in the 1980s or even earlier. It's only a matter of time before you're rotting in a cell.